I want to recognize myself for an opening statement. I want to thank our excellent witnesses for joining us today. This is our 7th, and it is our final of several years' worth of hearings that we've conducted on the problem of violent white supremacy, a traditional and pernicious enemy of the voting rights, the civil rights, and the civil liberties of the American people. In prior hearings over the last 3 years, long before violent insurrectionists bearing Confederate battle flags overran the Capitol on January 6, 2021, we found that violent white supremacy and its partner, anti-democratic extremism, today constitute the most serious domestic terror threat facing our people. Indeed, these same authoritarian and racist movements pose a similar danger to people living in many democratic societies on earth. Just last week, German authorities arrested dozens of far-right extremists, including members of a royal house in Germany seeking restoration of the Second Reich, an active duty German soldier, former members of the German police and elite special forces units, and neo-Nazi activists for allegedly participating in a violent right-wing plot to topple the German government and seize power. The coup plotters, many of whom were heavily armed when arrested, were inspired by the American insurrection of January 6th and are followers of deranged online QAnon conspiracy theories. They profess that the democratic German government is an imposter corporate subsidiary of the United States run by the American deep state. The insurrectionists plan to disrupt the German power grid and take parliament by force to impose a new authoritarian and anti-Semitic government. The German people and democracies around the world are fortunate that their law enforcement and intelligence agencies acted with speed and vigor to interrupt the conspiracy before the conspirators could succeed in staging a full-blown January 6th-style attack on the German government. It would be comforting to believe that the threat of violent white supremacy has subsided here in America in the wake of more than 900 criminal prosecutions being brought by the United States Department of Justice against January 6th insurrectionists and rioters for assaulting federal officers, destroying federal property, interfering with a federal proceeding, engaging in seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow or put down the government, and numerous other offenses. But the threats have not subsided and are very much still with us today. On May 14th, 2022, an 18-year-old white supremacist named Peyton Gendron, jacked up on online propaganda about the racist and anti-Semitic Great Replacement theory, entered a Top supermarket in Buffalo with an illegally modified AR-15 semi-automatic rifle and murdered 10 African-American people, wounding 3 others. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, state charges, and is offered to plead guilty on federal charges, including hate crime charges based on his premeditation to commit domestic terrorism. We are living through an onslaught of such violent threats and attacks, taking place directly against political figures, too. Everyone knows that Representative Gabby Giffords, of course, was the victim of an assassination attempt a decade ago at a constituent meeting in Arizona, and Representative Steve Scalise was also the victim of a deranged political shooter back in 2017 at baseball practice not far from the Capitol. A month ago, an extremist who was loaded up on internet conspiracy theories and made statements like Hitler did nothing wrong broke into House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's home in San Francisco and bludgeoned her 82-year-old husband, Paul Pelosi, in the head with a hammer with the intent of kidnapping the Speaker and breaking her kneecaps. In the run-up to January 6th, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was the target of a kidnapping and assassination plot by racist anti-government extremists. The ranking member, Ms. Mace, has seen her home vandalized and her privacy violated by someone who scrawled Antifa symbols on it. We live in a violent society, and the violence exists across the spectrum of political extremism, but the movements of violent white supremacy and anti-government extremism lead America in fomenting terroristic violence and disseminating propaganda to incite it. Both the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security identify white supremacy is the most lethally dangerous domestic terror threat our country faces. This hearing will help us to understand the continuing evolution of the white supremacist and extremist anti-government movement, specifically the strategic turn of major far-right groups to focus their wrath on local governments and school boards since the January 6th riot and insurrection and subsequent federal criminal prosecutions, the mobilization of white supremacist groups to attack the LGBTQ community in private clubs and public places, the emergence of Christian nationalism as an organizing ideological principle, and the growing prominence of the Great Replacement theory as a unifying field conspiracy theory for the motivation of far right-wing politics. Please consider this video highlighting the proliferation of extremist violence against Americans.
It was a troubling mix of neo-Confederate, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic, and apparently, according to them, pro-America.
Racially motivated violent extremism, specifically of the sort that advocates for the superiority of the white race, is a persistent, evolving threat.
We have certainly seen, unmistakably, the kind of rise in domestic extremism tied to white supremacy in ways we've just never seen before.
Buffalo officials are calling the mass shooting racially motivated violent extremism. But for some, that's not enough.
A 180-page manifesto surfaced online shortly after the attack and took credit for the violence in the name of white supremacy.
I came from heaven.
Yeah, God sent us here.
Yep.
So I pray to Almighty God and ask each of you to dig deep and steel yourselves for this war.
Whereas because of our covenant with God, we are equipped and delegated by Him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy.
The defendant's goal was to not necessarily capture Governor Whitmer, but it was to, quote, set off a second American Civil War.
Arresting 31 people as part of this group who were allegedly piled up in the back of a U-Haul truck. They were tipped off by a concerned citizen who said they witnessed what looked like a little army getting into the back of that truck.
Police say 21-year-old Robert Aaron Long admitted to being responsible for the killings at 3 separate spas that left 8 dead. 7 of the victims are women. 6 are of Asian descent.
We know who you are. We know who you are. You can leave freely, but we can find you.
Members of a white nationalist group show up at a school board meeting. Members of the Proud Boys stood watch at the meeting of the new Hanover County Board of Education.
We've never seen white nationalist groups so obviously represented at a school board meeting before.
Dozens of white supremacists marched through Boston today. The group wore white masks and was seen boarding Orange Line trains at the Haymarket Station. Some carried police shields and flags with them. They are members of a group called the Patriot Front.
Members of the Tree of Life Synagogue, conducting a peaceful service in their place of worship, were brutally murdered by a gunman targeting them simply because of their faith.
Another act of terror in America. The country again left to ask, where does this hate come from?
But if they want some, they know where we'll be at.
Proud of your boy.
Come get some.
I look forward to hearing the testimony. We will hear from our witnesses and how we can all work together best in Congress and across the country to combat violent extremism when it appears. And with that, I now recognize the distinguished ranking member, Ms. Mace, for her opening statement.